Well, hello again, my friends, and welcome once more to the Invisible College. And have we got a good one for you today? It's the long-awaited Joseph of Arimathea Comes to Britain, part 4 of my Grail series that I've been doing. And I know some of you have been tearing your hair out waiting for this one. I hope you're going to enjoy it. It's going to go in directions that might surprise you somewhat. Let's get on with the Secrets of the Grail Legend, Part 4. This one's called Joseph of Arimathea in Britain. And you probably heard the legends about Joseph of Arimathea. I'll just say a few words about that before we get started, really. Joseph of Arimathea is an interesting character. He's a character who only comes in towards the end of the Bible. And he becomes Jesus' undertaker. But I'm not going to spoil what's coming onwards, but it's a very important figure to do with the whole story of the Holy Grail, about the quest for the Holy Grail and King Arthur's knights. The Grail appears at a banquet they're having, and it's sort of just suddenly it's there, and they're all sort of blown away by this, and it seems to feed them. Every knight gets his most favourite food, and then suddenly as it had come, it disappears. And they were left scratching their heads, and they decided they've got to go out and find the Grail. Where's it gone? We've got to get it back. And that's kind of like the concluding part of the whole Arthurian story. And this Grail is said to be the cup that's used at the Last Supper. Probably not a cup, actually. It's probably something more like a big bowl that you would use for mixing wine with water. They call them a crater or crater in Latin. And they would mix wine with water before drinking it. They didn't drink it neat like we do. They'd have it diluted. And then you could either scoop up with your cup from this big punch bowl kind of thing, or you could, take a piece of bread and dip it in it, like we dip biscuits in tea today. They dip their bread in the wine pot and eat that. And in the Last Supper in the Bible, Jesus takes a piece of bread. It must have been something like a piece of pita bread or something, and he calls it a wine sop. He says to the one I give this sop to is the one who's going to betray me, and then gives it to Judas Iscariot. So we've got to understand that's probably what we're talking about more, is a big bowl that you would mix wine in. But in popular parlance, it's a kind of chalice, really. This is what we're talking about. And Joseph of Arimathea is this character who is said to have brought the wine, this either chalice or cup or bowl or whatever it was, to Britain. And then people used to, as long as it was here, it brought a blessing to the country. And then when it vanished, that brought on the wasteland, when there was sort of famine time and nothing would grow, and there were constant wars, invasions, and it was darkness all the time. It's the sort of winter of our discontent for about 3 years or something. And the knights went off to look for this Grail, that only the Grail could heal the wasteland of Lloegres. Lloegres is actually the old name for England rather than Wales. We can talk a lot about Wales, but England, the ancient name for it was Lloegres, before the Romans came, before the Anglo-Saxons came, and that was the kingdom that was plunged into darkness, because that's mainly where the main invasions came in, wasn't it? And the wars with the Anglo-Saxons and others invading. So anyway, that's the basic narrative. We'll go into this story more. We're going to look into all the different traditions about this and see where they take us. And it's not going to necessarily be where you might think. So anyway, Joseph of Arimathea in Britain. And I'm going to read out these slides as I go. According to tradition, the chief missionary to Britain was Joseph of Arimathea. He is a minor character in the Bible and is credited with converting the early, even pre-Roman invasion Britons to Christianity. So he may have come here before even the Roman invasion. They came in 43 AD to stay, that is. Julius Caesar had come over for a couple of summer holidays, but that didn't really count. They came in full force in 43 AD and didn't go for another 400 years roughly. But is it true? In this program, we're going to examine this story. We begin with the testimony of Gildas, a Welsh monk whose book De Exidio et Conquestu Britanniae, that's Latin, which means concerning the destruction and conquest of Britain, was likely written in the 6th century AD, so much later than these times. He's one of these Welsh monks. You have to understand that after Lloegres, or England, was invaded by the Anglo-Saxons, and it was going to go through all sorts of trauma, a bit like Game of Thrones, for a few centuries. But Wales was largely out of that. It retained the people, the ancient Britons hung on to Wales and parts of Scotland as well, when they had lost England. So a lot of things were preserved in Wales that were lost from England in this period of destruction and turmoil that we call the Dark Ages. We used to call them the Dark Ages. Nowadays, they don't like that term very much, so they call it the Early Middle Ages. I don't think that was very middle. To me, the Middle Ages is some 1200 to 1400, that sort of period. 1100 maybe to 1400, 1500. I wouldn't call it, I think the Dark Ages is a better term. Anyway, there we go. The conquest described is not the Roman invasion, but rather the Anglo-Saxon takeover of what was to become England. In the course of his Lamentations, Gildas provides clues to how Christianity was first brought to Britain in the 1st century BC, and not long after the crucifixion itself. He writes, "Meanwhile, these islands," which he means Britain, "stiff with cold and frost," well, it's not always like that, but in winter, yes, "and in a distant region of the world," distant certainly from Jerusalem or Rome, "remote from the visible sun, received the beams of light, that is, the holy precepts of Christ, the true Sun, showing to the whole world his splendour, not only from temporal firmament, but from the height of heaven, which surpasses even things temporal," that's of time. "At the latter part, as we know, of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, by whom his religion was propagated, without impediment, and death threatened to those who interfered with its professors." So this is a bit curious. I'm going to read that bit again, a bit more slowly, so we can understand what he's actually saying here. He just says, "At the latter part, as we know, of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, by whom his religion was propagated," etc. And this is strange, as it clearly says that Tiberius allowed the Christian religion to propagate, and even protected the professors, by which he means teachers of it, from molestation. Now then, Tiberius was the second Roman emperor, the first being Augustus. I'm going to show you this slide. Hang on. Right, Tiberius was the second Roman emperor, the first being Augustus Caesar, who died in AD 14. Tiberius was Augustus' stepson. He ruled over the Roman Empire from 14 AD till his own death in 37 AD. A somewhat paranoid man, Tiberius feared assassination. Accordingly, in 26 AD, he withdrew from Rome and moved to the island of Capri. That's near Naples, for those of you who look at maps. I haven't actually been to Capri or Naples, to be honest. I've been to Rome, and I've been to some other places in Italy, but I haven't been there. Apparently it's a really attractive island, very nice, lovely climate, and Tiberius certainly thought so. He stayed there for the rest of his life. He never returned. The crucifixion of Jesus is generally dated to 33 AD, so that's during his time when he's on Capri, Tiberius. Though I believe it took place in 29 AD. Either way, it seems strange that this paranoid man living on Capri would give special protection to Christian professors going to Britain. And we will return to this question later. Now then, here's another guy, Diodorus Siculus, that's Diodorus of Sicily, was a 1st century BC historian. He wrote about Britain soon after the abortive invasion by Julius Caesar. I said he came here for a couple of summer holidays, in 55 and again in 54 BC. Julius Caesar went back to Gaul. He realised Britain was beyond his reach. Certainly for the Roman Empire at that time, he needed to consolidate in Gaul first, and he didn't get a chance to come back and have another go. He confirms for us that the Britons would mine tin, that's Diodorus, and bring it in wagons to an island which he calls Ichthys. This name probably derives from the Greek word ichthys, meaning fish. This island seems to have functioned as a marketplace. Perhaps it was only once or twice a year that boats came from afar to this island to purchase tin from its miners. Maybe at other times Ichthys was a fish market. So calling the island Ichthys does suggest that people there, at least some of them, spoke Greek. And this is sort of corruption of the Greek, the Britons. The island of fish. And the island of fish, I think, would probably function as a fish market. Makes sense. One of the important things about this island was it was connected to the mainland by a causeway. So Ichthys is clearly an old name for St. Michael's Mount. It's a picturesque small island off the coast of western Cornwall. It is next to the beach town of Marazion. At high tides, St. Michael's Mount is cut off from the mainland of Cornwall. However, at low tide, it can be reached on foot via a causeway that goes back to the Bronze Age or before. Archaeology shows that this causeway goes back to the Bronze Age. Its importance is that at low tide, the island could be reached by traders on foot. At high tide, larger ships could dock there for purposes of trade. Now, I'll just come back to you again. I have actually been there. I've been there a number of times, actually. And maybe you have as well in Cornwall. If you ever go to Cornwall, if you go down towards Penzance, you're in the right area. And it's actually within that sort of open foot at the end of Cornwall. And you can imagine that is actually the first part of Britain that ships coming up, going through the Straits of Gibraltar, up, past Spain and past the Bay of Biscay, coming up to Britain. That's the first place they would go to, right in the foot of Cornwall, and that would be a very convenient place for them to go. And then from there, if they wanted to go to Wales, you would only have to go round past St. Ives, which is on the other part of the foot. So you can see here on the map, the foot here, if I call it, and St. Michael's Mount is tucked in under here. So that's where the ships would have come to do their trading. And then you could sail around here, go up here. This is taking you up the Severn Estuary. And if you go up here, you would find the way to Somerset down that way. But if you go the other way, you'd be in South Wales. I'm sorry it's not shown on the map here, but I think that's what they would do. They'd go up here and they'd go and buy other metals in Wales, particularly lead, and even some gold and silver they would get there. I don't know about copper so much. That was more a Cornish thing, but in ancient times, Cornish miners would trade tin for other goods. These would be brought by ship from as far away as the Levant, that's sort of Lebanon and Israel, or Egypt. Marazion, a village opposite Ichthys, means Zion on sea. Zion, of course, is the ancient name for Jerusalem, or at least that part of it which forms the city of David. So you can see you've got up here you've got Marazion. It's a village there, and here's the causeway leading to St. Michael's Mount today. This would be the island of Fish. So it's a very romantic place there, a sort of castle on top. And you can go there. It's a very interesting place. I recommend it if you're ever down in that direction. But Marazion is here, and Mare or Mara means ocean or sea, and Zion means this part of Jerusalem. The city of David is on Mount Sion, and there's another name for Jerusalem, or at least the older part of it. So Marazion would be Jerusalem, Zion on sea. As a tin merchant, Joseph would have visited Ichthys regularly and maybe even owned a house in Marazion. Well, it makes sense, doesn't it? If you're going to come there regularly, you probably own a house there or rent it out the rest of the time, but you've got somewhere to go and stay. And there's probably a little Jewish community there. So was it to Marazion in Cornwall that Joseph brought the Holy Grail? Though this may have been his point of landing, tradition says he took this precious object to Glastonbury. Now, Glastonbury, for those of you who don't know, is in Somerset, which is just to the north of Devon. It's not that far from Cornwall. It's up the Severn Estuary. On the southern side of it, you've got Somerset, and on the northern side of it, you've actually got Wales, southern Wales, particularly Glamorgan, which we're going to talk about later. So he's said to, in the traditions, to have gone to Glastonbury. So these are the Glastonbury legends. Local legends say that after the crucifixion, Joseph lived in Glastonbury, and it was there he built the first church. Other traditions assert that this church was actually built by Jesus, who they say lived there for a year. The reason he would have lived there for a year is if he stayed over, the ships have gone, and they've got to hang around in Britain until the next season. But they probably only had boats coming to Britain during the summer. They wouldn't risk the Atlantic storms in the winter. You would come probably in the summertime, I would think. Other traditions said that. The house where he lived later became a church dedicated to his mother Mary. That's the tradition. While there, or so it is said, Jesus met with the Druids. Well, maybe Druids were around at that time, perhaps preparing them for their later conversion. Who knows? And this sounds to me like a bit of church propaganda, but it's possible. I guess it's possible. I'm not wholly convinced that Jesus went to Britain, but it's possible. We'll come to that later. Joseph is also said to have stuck his staff into the ground on top of Wirral Hill. They say Wirral Hill. It's not the same hill as the Tor. There are a couple of hills in Glastonbury. Wirral Hill They say comes the name from Weariall Hill, that they're all worn out, they're tired, you know, they've gone a long way, walked a long way, oh, I'm exhausted. So old Joseph has hiked his way up to the top of the hill, and according to legend, he stuck the staff into the hilltop, and it took root and became the Glastonbury thorn, which is actually a type of thorn bush that actually grows in the Middle East and flowers at Christmas time. So that's a big deal in Glastonbury. The Queen Mother, you know, the old Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the wife of George VI, she used to have a sprig of the flowers from the Glastonbury thorn sent to her every Christmas. I don't know if the Queen did or if King Charles does now. Maybe he does. Anyway, that's what they used to say. And this legendary staff clearly symbolises his family tree. This is what this myth is all about. Planting it in the ground of Britain symbolises that he and his family were now permanent immigrants. They weren't going back. They're now going to stay here. And his family would stay in Britain and take root there. So his descendants are going to, you know, they're going to be British. They're going to stay here. But are any of these legends true? These Glastonbury legends? You know, you read about these in, there's lots of brochures and pamphlets and bits and pieces you'll find in Glastonbury that will tell you all about this, but they don't give you much documentation to where these myths come from. So we're going to probe a little bit further, and you're going to find that some of them are a bit threadbare, I'm afraid. To find answers, we must examine the subject in greater detail and from many angles. The truth turns out to be more surprising than the legend. Well, I think so anyway. So then, Joseph of Arimathea is a minor character in the Bible. Arimathea seems to have been his town of birth in Judah. So Joseph of Arimathea, he's the guy, he's the Joseph from Arimathea, not to be mixed up with Joseph from Nazareth, who was the carpenter. Different guy. The actual location of Arimathea is unknown, but some people believe it to be the city we today call Ramallah. No, I don't know why they think that, but there you go. Others assert that it was much further west, a town near to Lod. Now, Lod is where Lod Airport is, the airport that serves Jerusalem and Tel Aviv in Israel. It's the only big airport they have in Israel, really. There's another one in Eilat. I don't know if there's one up north. Maybe there is one near Haifa, but I don't know. But anyway, the one you normally would fly to is Lod, so presumably there used to be a town there. Was that Arimathea? Well, I don't know. In any case, Har Ramathaim means the high place or heights. This could be another name from Mount Zion, the old city of David, where the Last Supper is thought to have taken place. So they have this tradition. Hang on, I'm just going to come back to you for a second. They have a tradition that the Last Supper took place on Mount Zion. And actually, if you go to Mount Zion, they'll show you this is where the Last Supper took place. I can't believe it's the same building, but it may have done. And that's where King David was buried, somewhere around there. In Zion, that was the city of David, the original Jerusalem that he captured. And then they later spread up further hill behind it to make the city of Jerusalem as we know it today. It's a city on several different hills. And you've got a spring of water at Mount Zion that would have been, that's why people would have settled there. It's one of these places where they have a flow of water from underground springs that never stops. So that's a very valuable place in the Middle East, where you get these terrible droughts and a lot of it is deserty. So to have a constant water supply, cool, fresh water from underground, is an absolute prize. And you can see why David would have wanted to take Jerusalem. and to make that his capital, rather than Bethlehem, where he was born. Anyway, getting back here. In any case, Arimathea means the high place or heights. This could be another name for Mount Zion, the old city of David, where the Last Supper is thought to have taken place. Or it could be a house in Bethany. This village stands on top of the Mount of Olives, which is the highest hill in the Jerusalem area. We know Jesus went there. You bet he did. Bethany is where Martha and Mary and Lazarus lived. Lazarus was their brother. He died. And they sent word to Jesus, "Oh, our brother's died." And Jesus came back and he was already buried. And he said, "Well, we'll raise him from the dead." They said, "Well, it's been 3 days. Don't open that. It's going to smell." He said, No. They opened the grave, and he called to Lazarus and says, "Lazarus, come out, come out." And out Lazarus comes, not dead after all, risen from the dead. So that's a huge miracle, to raise Lazarus from the dead when he's been dead for 3 days. And this took place in Bethany, which is this town on the top of the Mount of Olives. So it's a mile or two back from Jerusalem, but you can go there today. And anyway, some people think Joseph was related to this family. He was their father. I don't know if that's true. Maybe he was a neighbour, but that's a possibility as well. Joseph from the high place, and the high place being up there, Bethany. Everyone knows what he's talking about. Anyway, that's another possibility. He might have had a house there and a house in Jerusalem. He'd be the equivalent of a multimillionaire in those days. He's a very rich man from all this trading in silver and gold and lead and tin, and copper even. He's a wealthy, working on the metal exchange. And people dealing with metals tend to be, they've got a bit of that themselves, haven't they? So anyway, let's come back here. It is also possible that the name Arimathea is symbolic. It could simply derive from the high place, could indicate a high position in society rather than a geographical location. In other words, it might be that he's from up there, he's one of them, he's one of the high ones. Maybe it means something like that. We really don't know, do we? After all, Joseph was a member of the Jewish council of elders called the Sanhedrin. He was an important man, He was an oligarch. He was a billionaire. He was a rich man. Yes, they'd been conquered by the Romans, but the Romans respected him. He was, they needed people like him to be supplying the metal you're going to make. You can't make coins if you haven't got metal, can you? So you need gold to make sovereigns, whatever their equivalent was. But copper coins and things, you need copper, and you need to make bronze coins, you need some tin in it. He's an important man. In all events, it seems likely that by the time of the crucifixion, he lived either in or close to Jerusalem. Very likely, as I said, on Mount Zion. If he was the guy who owned the house on Mount Zion, that's where they held the Last Supper. Yeah, Jesus didn't own a house there, did he? None of the apostles did. They're Nazarenes from up north in Galilee, or the little towns around Galilee, where Jesus preached and taught, like Capernaum. So they were outsiders, come from the north. So the Bethany girls and Lazarus, they lived in Bethany. So this guy, it seems the likely one to have owned the house. And they set this all up, him riding in. You remember he tells someone to go to a certain house and to find an ass there and bring it. And Jesus is going to ride the ass into Jerusalem, because that's in the prophecies that he would do that. So they had this whole thing is being staged. and the house had to be there, prepared, ready for the Last Supper. Anyway. Right. Hang on. Joseph makes it only a brief appearance in the Gospels, where he takes on the role of undertaker. And I'm going to quote here from John's Gospel. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who also was a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. The same story concerning the burial of Jesus is repeated in the other Gospels, but with a little more detail. Mark tells us how Joseph had to take courage to ask for the body, and how Pilate was surprised to hear that Jesus was already dead. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now, the spices were supplied by a guy called Nicodemus, who was another secret disciple of Jesus, and another rich guy, the Pharisee, and he could afford to buy expensive spices to probably embalm the body before burial. So very important. Many people, myself included, believe that the funeral wrap or shroud in which the body of Jesus was wrapped is one and the same as the cloth now called the Shroud of Turin. Now, it's very hard to think of who else could be the figure on it, or how it could have been faked, as some people believe. Now, if you go into this subject, and I've done a video on this, you'll see that the figure on the shroud, there's a lot of analysis been done on this, photographing it with different types of light and taking negatives and blowing them up, or passing them through AI even. And they found things like there were coins placed on the eyes, and all the lash marks are all there from the whipping he received, the puncture wounds in his head from the crowning with thorns, the holes in his wrists. They didn't hammer the nails through the palms, they hammered them through the wrist. The story of Joseph continues in the apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus. Now, I'll tell you about Nicodemus bringing the spices to embalm the body, so he was involved in that. He was a Pharisee who met with Jesus secretly in order to learn more. Like Joseph, he became a secret disciple. Unfortunately, this document, previously known as the Acts of Pilate, it used to be called the Acts of Pilate, they call it the Gospel of Nicodemus today, if you want to find it, is not contemporary. It was probably in Constantinople in the 4th century that it was written. Nevertheless, it may contain fragments of truth amid speculations. According to Nicodemus, Joseph was blamed for the body of Jesus no longer being in the tomb after the stone was found rolled back. The Romans and Jews accused him and the apostles of having removed it during the night. The idea of Jesus rising from the dead and angels opening the tomb seemed preposterous. Joseph absolutely denies the charges, and Pilate orders that he be put in prison while he decides his eventual fate. In the account of Nicodemus, the Holy Grail, in which Joseph had collected some of Jesus' blood, is brought to him while he is in jail. This is the first mention of its power to give nourishment, and Joseph is able to receive sustenance from it. So there again we have this, then another miracle occurs. The door to Joseph's cell is opened and he's told to go free. So Joseph getting released. So we have other stories about St. Peter being released by an angel, and so it's a similar thing. Maybe it's the same angel, I don't know. But anyway, Joseph was released from jail, and he's told to make his escape, which he does. Joseph sneaks out of jail, taking the Holy Grail with him. From now on, he's a fugitive. Yeah, he's run away, isn't he? He can't show his face around Jerusalem. You know, the pilot must be absolutely furious that he's got out of jail. So he's got to make his getaway. The additional story carries on from other sources, which I'll go into in a minute. Joseph boards a ship with a party of 12 apostles of his own. These include many of Jesus' closest companions: Mary Magdalene, her sister Martha, their maid Marcella, and their brother Lazarus. All these people from Bethany, probably his next door neighbours, maybe his family, we don't know exactly. They all lived in Bethany, which may have been Arimathea or the high place. No other people went with him as well. This story is told in a popular book called The Drama of the Lost Disciples. It is by George F. Jowett and first published in 1961. I can show it to you here. This is Jowett's book, The Drama of the Lost Disciples. I hope the text comes out right way around. In some videos it seems to get reversed, but Drama of the Lost Disciples. An interesting book. It's got errors, and I remember Alan Wilson gave me this book, and he said to me, Adrian, read it carefully. He said he's made a lot of mistakes, not to be trusted, or not to be wholly trusted, but he says it's an interesting book, and it's got a lot of material in there that is useful for us, for what we're doing. Anyway, I've read that, and yes, I'd agree with everything Alan Wilson said on that. Interesting, but not to be fully trusted. Now, he claims this story was found by Cardinal Caesar Baronius, who wrote a book, which is not translated into English, called Annales Ecclesiastici, so the Annals of the Church. Baronius had evidently found that the story in the Vatican... I'll read that bit again. Baronius had evidently found the story in the Vatican Library and in a prose poem called Mireia by a French writer called Mistral. So this Cardinal Baronius claims to have found the story about Joseph going with his 12 companions in these two sources. Unfortunately, the reference to Mistral's Mireio can't be true. Cardinal Baronius, 1508 to 1607, had been dead for more than 2 centuries before Mistral, who was 1830 to 1940, was even known. So Baronius can't have referred to Mistral. He can't have known anything about Mistral, but he may have known about the document in the Vatican Library, which Mistral may also have known about, and he writes an excerpt from it in his Mireio, which is not about anything to do with this, actually. It's a prose poem. It's a love poem, actually, a love story. And it's possible that Baronius saw in the Vatican Library the same prose poem that Mireio quotes, and this is in Occitan, a dialect of Provence. Well, you know where Provence is in southern France, isn't it? However, though Mistral's poem does indeed speak of Joseph and his 12 companions, including Mary Magdalene, Martha, Lazarus and Marcella, their destination is not Britain. In the poem, they land on the island of Camargue in southern France. This is near Arles in southern France, i.e. in Provence. The poem says nothing about Joseph and his party going on to England. In fact, they seem to have settled in Provence and have churches named after them. That's Mary Magdalene in particular, and some of the others, and the other Mary, mother of Jesus, all said to have stayed, or most of them anyway, in France. So to quote that as backing up the Glastonbury legends is a mistake. As Alan said, he's not to be trusted. He's very direct in the way he writes this, and if you didn't look up, because we have the internet now, we can do this, but you can look up this Miraio, Mistral, and you can find a poem, and you can find it for yourself and check. It's there, and it's about Provence. Well, there is an alternative story about how Christianity came to Britain, which is one recorded in Welsh records. According to this story, Joseph came to Britain accompanied by Bran the Blessed, the father of the legendary King Caractacus, who's called Caradoc in Welsh, and the latter's daughter, Saint Urgine. So Urgine, or it should be Eugenie in modern parlance, the same as the mother of King Arthur, Igerna. That's Arthur's mother, isn't it? Igerna. She's named after Saint Urgine. So anyway, this is an alternative story, King Caractacus. We dealt with King Caractacus in the last lecture in Arthurian, and Arthurian having this kingdom, Britannia Prima, with a palace near Chichester, Fishbourne. We talked about them. You can watch that other lecture again if you haven't already seen it. Together, Joseph and Urgine founded the first Christian college, which is called the Chor Urgine, which means the choir of Urgine, or the circle of Urgine, at Llanwit Major in Glamorgan. That's what the legends, or what people believe today. I think there's a bit of a confusion there, but I don't want to confuse you too much. And this story is much more plausible than the Glastonbury bog one. For one thing, Joseph's friend, mentor and student was Bran the Blessed. And he was a revered figure and former king of the Lloegres tribe whose land this was. So the Lloegres lived in South Wales, in Glamorgan, and also in Gwent, and some other bits going up the River Wye as well, and also a bit of Carmarthenshire. So it's quite a big territory, but they were the major tribe there, and they're the ones who fought against the Romans. And St. Urgine was a daughter of their king Caradoc, who was the son of Bran, Caractacus. And we talked a lot about him in the last lecture, but I'm going to recap a little bit here. We met Caractacus, remember that statue? I don't know if he was always posing in his loincloth. I doubt it. But anyway, that's how a Welsh patriot, I think in the 19th century, represented this doughty warrior. We met Caradoc in the previous lecture. He was a redoubtable warrior king who fought the Romans for 9 long years. Not years, before he was captured in AD 52. So he was betrayed. You remember this from the last lecture. He lost a battle. He returned to Cati Mandua, the queen of the Brigantes up in the north of England. And she was a friend of the Romans, and she didn't really want to get involved, so she betrayed him to the Romans, and he and his whole family were taken prisoner. He made an impassioned speech in the Senate asking for clemency. He said to Claudius, he said, I'm a king, I had many people, I'm king over many peoples, many nations. Of course I had to stand up against you. You know, I'm the king, aren't I? You beat me, yeah, you beat me. And you can kill me, it's in your power. But if you do that, it will soon be forgotten. But if you show clemency, you'll be remembered forever. And Claudius thought that was a good idea. Well, I think he had ideas of his own, but we'll come to that. Claudius was evidently moved by this and spared him, but with the proviso that he was never again carry arms against Rome. Instead of death, he was given a palace with extensive grounds on top of the Esquiline Hill in Rome. Now, the Esquiline Hill is one of the less fashionable parts of Rome today, anyway. It's a bit further out from the centre. You can get up there, and I've been up there, and that's where Claudius gave land to Caractacus and built him a palace there. It was a much bigger, covering the top of this hill. It was obviously a big estate at the time. He wanted to impress this guy, and he wanted to be friends with him. He didn't want to throw him in the Tiber. He reckoned it's much better to make friends than to make or to teach lessons in punishments. So instead of death, he was given a palace with extensive grounds on top of the Esquiline Hill. Unlike most Roman emperors, Claudius was not a brute who used force to simply destroy enemies. He was highly intelligent and also knew a lot of history. In fact, he wrote books on history which have unfortunately been lost to us. Maybe they'll turn up one day, who knows, but at the moment they're lost. But he was a smart guy, well educated, and he followed a different policy, using the stick when only absolutely necessary. For the most part, he offered carrots. His policy was to establish himself as overlord of client kings. He would let the former rulers of Britain, tribal leaders, continue to rule, but in his name. At the same time, he showed them how the Roman way of life was better. First, they and their children would be educated in Rome, enjoying the higher standard of living it provided. Then they would be sent back to implement what they had learnt in their own countries. And we saw this in the last lecture with Arimathea, where Claudius had a huge palace built for Arimathea at Fishbourne. It's the largest Roman villa in north of Italy. It's on the sort of size of Nero's palace. It's enormous, with all the odd cons that you would expect. So this guy, Arthurian, going to decide that actually I'd like this Roman way of living. It's much more comfortable living in a palace like this than in a mud hut, a roundhouse or something that we used to build. This Roman way really works. Caradoc was a perfect example. He had learnt the hard way that militarily the Britons could not stand up to Rome. It was better for them to make peace and pay taxes. If they did that, they would be left to more or less get on with their lives. Sensible man. Meanwhile, Caradoc and his family, if not already Christians, and I very much doubt they were, there is a tradition that Joseph of Arimathea, as we looked at, came to Britain in the last year of, the years of Tiberius, which were put back to 36 or 37 AD, long before the time of Claudius, and converted the Britons then. If that's true, then they would have been Christian already when they came to Rome. But I don't see the evidence for that, and I'll show you what I mean shortly. Caradoc had a daughter, Gladys, who seems to have been adopted by Claudius himself. Perhaps to honour him, and she had taken the name Claudia, and she married Pudens, a Roman senator who had served in Britain. Now, we've met Pudens before, and I'll come back to you for a minute. Pudensis, was one of the senior, well, he was a senator, but he was with the Roman army at the time of Suetonius, who was the first governor of Britain after the invasion, took part in the invasion. And Pudens is recognised in a memorial stone at Chichester, celebrating Cogidumdus, which is the name they give to Arviragus, a title of some sort, to build a temple to Minerva and Neptune, I think. Minerva being the goddess of wisdom, and Neptune the god of the sea. And of course Chichester's on the sea, isn't it? Anyway, this temple had a plaque saying about how it had been dedicated to Claudius, and the person who got the money together to build it was Pudens Pudentini, Pudens, son of the Pudenti. It was a senatorial family in Rome, and Pudens is the same guy who married Claudia. And he was a convert to Christianity. It must have been after this, building this temple, I would have thought. Maybe he did it anyway, but I don't know. Here we see a family tree of the British saints in Rome. So you've got Bran the Blessed, we mentioned him before. He had a daughter, another Gladys, who married Aulus Plautius, who was another governor of Britain, and King Caradoc was his son, and he had sons Collinus and Cunnan. Collinus was a future king of Britain. Linus, who was the first bishop of Rome, first Gentile bishop. St. Peter was the first bishop, but that was of the Jewish church. The two were separate at first, the Jewish church and the Gentile church. The Gentile church really stemmed from St. Paul. So Linus was the first bishop, and Salog married St. Urgine, Salog, Lord of Salisbury, so that's in the Welsh records. Now we have the Gladys here, Claudia, who marries Rufus Pudens, and they have 4 children. St. Timothy, he's accompanied Paul on some of his trips, and the letter to Timothy from St. Paul in the New Testament. Prudensiana and Praxedes, the 2 daughters, they both have churches in the Esquiline area, and they used to collect the bodies of martyrs and bury them in the catacombs underneath the Palatium Botanicum, which became the church of St. Praxedes or Praxede. If you go to that church, very beautiful church in Rome today, you'll see all about this and how all the martyrs are buried. I think something like 13 popes are buried there. Extraordinary. Here you can see the Church of St. Prudensiana, which stands on the site of the former senatorial house of Pudens. And actually they have excavated underneath here, and they found his house. The different rooms and so on underneath here, underneath Rome. So extraordinary. This is the real ground zero for Christianity in Rome. And I think it's very interesting that they built a huge basilica later on, I think in the 17th century or something, maybe a bit earlier. There's a huge basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore on top of the Esquiline Hill, just across the road actually from the temple, the Church of Praxedes, and that Church of Maria Maggiore, that huge church, would have been standing on ground that would have been part of the property of the Palatium Botanicum at the time, the Palace of the Britons. And that's where Pope Francis, the last pope, had himself buried. He's not buried where they usually bury popes. he preferred to be buried there. And that's very interesting because, as I say, there were early popes were buried in the catacombs underneath St. Prassede, and very likely underneath the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. They probably connect to those catacombs. I don't know, nobody's told me that, but I bet they do. In which case he wants to be with the early popes in the true ground zero, not the St. Peter's Basilica, which is a very vulgar building in my opinion. But there we go. Now then, getting back to our story, it seems to me a likely scenario that Joseph of Arimathea, the tin merchant, already knew Bran the Blessed and maybe Caradoc from earlier trading missions to Wales. You know, he was regularly going there. And he could easily have met up with them again in Rome. Then, with Claudius's blessing, they could have returned to Britain. Now, you have to remember that if he turned up in Rome, for the Roman Christians, this guy is an absolute superstar, you know, Joseph of Arimathea. The tradition has it that he was actually either Mary's uncle or her brother. So he was either the uncle or great-uncle of Jesus. But over beyond that, you know, even if that weren't true, and I think it probably was, he was a superstar for having, you know, taken the body down from the cross and buried it in his own tomb. I mean, what service to give? And he could tell them, he knew Jesus, he could tell them, you know, first-hand stories of what happened and what he knew and so on. So he's going to be very, very well received in the Christian community. And given that at this time of Claudius, they were not persecuting Christians, Claudius seemed quite well disposed to them. It's not unlikely that he met Claudius as well and was able to tell him all about it. You know, Claudius was he was a man who would like to know what was going on, and he would have welcomed the chance to talk to someone like this that was a senior Jew from the Sanhedrin who had converted to Christianity, who had met this man Jesus and had buried him and could tell him the full story himself. So this would have been one of the professors, so-called, being sent to Britain. So Claudius, it seems, favoured Christians. He himself was not a Christian or convert. He may have been, but we've not been told that. However, he maybe liked the idea of this new peaceful religion taking hold in Britain. It suited his purposes. Yeah, you bet it did. But what about the Tiberius connection? Yeah, what about the Tiberius connection? That's the one that Gildas, the 6th century, and that's, pretty early. Earlier than Dunstan, certainly. Didn't Gildas write that Christianity came to Britain in the last year of his reign? And that would be 36 to 37 AD, and therefore before Claudius came onto the throne. Could have been Joseph going there, but nothing to do with Claudius. How do we reconcile this early date of Joseph coming to Britain much later when Claudius was emperor? Didn't say Claudius, did it? It said Tiberius, last year of Tiberius. Well, there's a simple answer to that. The birth name of Claudius was Tiberius Claudius Drusus. Later, this was changed to Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Yeah? So, his first name was Tiberius. The constant was that his first name was Tiberius, and this was followed by Claudius. So he wouldn't be called Tiberius while Tiberius was alive. That would be too confusing, wouldn't it? He's got his name, showing respect, but he's going to be called Claudius. And everyone knows him as Claudius. They don't then start calling him Tiberius. So He's the Tiberius, I believe, that authorised the people to go to Britain. Thus, for Gildas to call him Tiberius would not be a mistake. To avoid confusion, while Tiberius himself was alive, he was probably called Claudius, and the name stuck. In the Welsh records, he is referred to as Saint Illyd, a man from Israel. That Saint Illyd accompanied Bran and, with Saint Urgine, established the first Christian college, not just in Britain, but in the world, is certainly possible. That's what the Welsh records all tell us. As Jesus' uncle, Joseph knew the life story of Jesus from its beginning, nativity, right up to its end, crucifixion, death, burial, resurrection and ascension. Yeah, he was a constant figure. Mary's brother or uncle. I think he's probably her brother, actually, when I think about it all. The school they founded, known as the Cor Urgine, had 12 cells for students in emulation of the 12 apostles. Joseph would have been their teacher. After he died, this role would likely have passed to Urgine. So I don't believe he brought 12 disciples with him from Israel or from Judea, including Mary Magdalene and Martha and Lazarus and all that. Maybe they travelled with him on the boat to Marseille, but they weren't his apostles or his disciples. He would have had disciples among the Britons. The only question mark is whether St. Illyd, who in various Welsh texts is called a man from Israel, really is Joseph of Arimathea. This is not proven, neither is it disproven. We simply don't know for sure that he was. So I'll make that point. I'm not claiming that we have definite evidence that St. Illyd in the Welsh textbooks is the same person as Joseph of Arimathea, but it makes an awful lot of sense when they say that this is the man from Israel who came and with Caractacus and Urgine converted the Silures particularly, went to South Wales and set up this first church, the first college. It makes a lot of sense to me that it's the same person as Joseph of Arimathea of tradition. But what about Glastonbury? Critics will say, surely this is Avalon, the island of apples. Well, Aval, it's spelled with an F rather than a V in Welsh. Aval does mean apple in Welsh, but the Welsh for island is Ynys, not on. No, would they have abbreviated it to on? I don't think so. It would be Ynys Avalon. It would have been Ynys Aval if they were going to call it that, but they wouldn't have called it that anyway. I've been into this subject in depth elsewhere, so will not dwell on it here, but even William of Malmesbury, who wrote a famous history of Glastonbury and its abbey, was not entirely convinced on this point. No, William, he's not convinced, and he says there could be another explanation for this name. It's a person's name. William of Malmesbury says that other people claim that Avalon derives from a person's name. And this is confirmed in the Harleian 3859 genealogies from the 10th century. We're told here that the Virgin Mary had a blood relative called Anna. She married a man called Beli, and they had a son called Amalek, and his son was called Avalak. And this claim is repeated in other genealogies, such as the Jesus College 20 manuscript. Sometimes they actually make, I'll just come onto the screen here. Sometimes these traditions put in Amalek or Avlek in between, before Abalak or Avalak. Other times, Avalak, is actually the son of this couple, Beli and Anna. Beli, I believe, is the same personages. He's the same person as Lloegres, and I think I got something on that here. Yes, we'll come back here, deal with that. If Joseph of Arimathea really was Mary's brother, then a daughter or granddaughter of his would have been a blood relative of Mary. Of course it would. If he's her brother, you know, his daughter or is going to be her niece, and any sons he'd have would be nephews, wouldn't they? And or if it's a granddaughter, it's a great niece or great nephew. So the man Beli or Belin is also recognised in the Welsh triads. He was a prince from the London area who brought with him a retinue of men to carry on the fight against the Romans, putting himself under the command of King Caradoc of Glamorgan. Now that fits with the story of Arviragus, and I believe that Arviragus, which is a title, it means King of the Lowlands or King of the Ploughed Land. Arviragus, his family name was Beli, which was a popular name in the London area in the Trinovantes. They had Beli Mawr a few generations earlier, or Belin, Cunobelinus, Cunobelin, just a couple of generations before him. So we have this. The name Beli is not out of place, and he's marrying this Anna, and they would be the couple that are mentioned in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, where he talks about this couple, Arviragus, and Claudius brings over his daughter. Well, it wasn't one of Claudius's own daughters. It could well have been an adopted daughter, who they call, or in Geoffrey is called Genu Issa. And Genu, family, Issa, feminine form of Isus or Jesus. So the family of Jesus. Anna, this is the same marriage, and he builds them a palace. Well, there's a palace at Fishbourne, isn't there? Built by Claudius. So we have the details are all there, and it's not at all impossible that Arviragus' son was given lands in the south of Wales by Caractacus. Maybe he had earlier given those lands to Beli before he became king, or before he made his agreement with the Romans. He was still working with Caractacus. Maybe he was given that bit of land and he passed it on to his son or grandson. Makes sense to me anyway. And that's the Avalac. The son of grandson inherited Avalon, which was called this after him. That's what I think. So without going into detail, the real Avalon is not in Somerset, but rather in Glamorgan in South Wales, and here it is. This is the coast here. Down here, you've got Ogmore Castle, and there's the river running up here. I'm sorry, this map's not all that clear. There should be a coastline around here somewhere. But this river runs up here called the Iwenny, and it goes up here to Llanillid, which means the church of Illid, St. Illid. That's where he lived. And nearby to it, just 3 miles away, is Trefran, which means the manor of Bran. So that would be where Bran retired, not far from his confessor. They're all connected by this whitened river. And here at Llanillid there is a core, or circle bank. Quite an extraordinary place, actually. I've been there. An extraordinary atmosphere, and I think that's the real Cor Urgain. But that again is another story. And then flowing into this river is a little stream. They call the word for stream in Welsh is Nant. So it's the Nant Brynglas. There's a hill called the Brynglas. Bryn means a hill. Glass means blue-green. So the blue-green hill. And that's the same as, Glastonbury Tor would be a Brynglas. There are other Brynglasses in Wales as well. There's one near Cardiff, actually. So It's not an unusual name. The Brynglas, the Green Hill, and the Nant Brynglas would flow into here, and the name of the confluence here. Excuse my phone making noises. The confluence of the rivers would be named after the smaller river going into the larger one, so it would be called the Aber means a confluence, Aber Brynglas. So Aberglaston, Aber Brynglas is the same. That's where it is. And the nearest town, or the nearest small, it's actually more like a village, is a place called Coychurch today. In ancient times it was called Llangrallo. And you'll read about it's named after a Saint Crallo, but there's no other evidence for Saint Crallo. I think Llangrallo means Church of the Grail. And the Grail Castle is actually here, Coity Castle. And I've written a lot about this in a book of mine called The Blood of Avalon. So you can read about that there. Anyway, that's, I think, is the real story. So Glastonbury is an anglicisation for the town on the Nant Brynglas, which is a small stream that runs from near Coychurch to join the Afon Iwenny or Whiten River. When the two rivers meet, should be called Aber Brynglas. The town of Glastonbury would have been what is now the village of Coychurch. The old name for this church is Llangrallo, remarkably similar to Church of the Grail. You may disagree with me, but I think so. So, what of the Grail itself, which is said to have been brought to Britain by Joseph of Arimathea? Is it the cup from the Last Supper that Jesus used to consecrate wine? Oh, that's one thought. Or was the Grail or Graal a dish used for either cooking or serving fish at the Last Supper? Well, that's another possibility. Jesus is very much linked with the symbol of the fish. The fish was an early symbol they used to draw it in graffiti on walls and things in early Christianity. And the word for bishop in Latin is episcopus, which means foot out of the fish. So in other words, the bishop who wears a hat like a fish's head, a mitre, would be the boots on the ground for the fish being Jesus. And why a fish? I think it's because people in the old days used to think about the earth being like a bubble, having a bubble of air, which was separated by something they call a firmament in the book of Genesis, a sort of barrier that separates the waters above from the waters below. And the waters above would be what we would call outer space. And they thought of that as being a huge ocean up there beyond. And what goes through oceans or seas? Fish. So someone coming from above could be symbolized as a fish that's come down to earth. So that's one version of the mythology. Another one is this. Wolfram von Eschenbach, who's a Meistersinger from Germany, who wrote one of the first Grail stories, or he wrote actually Percival, and Percival was searching for the Grail. He writes of it as a stone, or lapis exilis, as he puts it. I think that comes from ex chalice, a stone from heaven. Or it could be the stone of exile, I suppose, the stone that's come from somewhere else. The meaning of these words has been debated for centuries, but it's clearly said to be a stone. Given the context of the passage, you have to read the whole passage in Wolfram to understand this, is associated with the legend of the phoenix. It would seem to be a kind of meteorite, but linked to the stone of destiny too. So that's what I think about the Grail. It's something that's come from heaven. So in reality, it's none of these. The Grail is not an object, but a symbol. That's what I believe. It symbolises a numinous presence that comes from higher worlds and can produce supernatural results. It is food which nourishes the soul. In the Bible, this is referred to as the pneuma hagion, or spiritus sanctus in Latin, pneuma hagion in Greek. It is the Holy Ghost, or Holy Breath. So the Holy Ghost, which Joseph of Arimathea brought to Britain, was the Holy Presence that found a home in the school he founded called the Cour Urgain. So that's the vessel. The vessel is actually the cour, it's the college that provides a sanctuary for the Holy Ghost to enter and to feed them. That's what it's all about. As long as Britain stayed true to the Christian faith brought to earth by Jesus Christ, then it flourished. But when that spirit departed, then you get the wasteland. So probably in King Arthur's legend, when the Grail turns up, they decide, well, we must go out and find it. Where's this vessel? What they should have done is said, right, we've got to sanctify ourselves. This is talking about we've got to raise the vibrational level of our college, our round table. We've got to make it something more spiritual and turn to heaven for salvation, not just the sword. And that's the real lesson, perhaps, of King Arthur here. However, treachery, deceit, and bad leadership led to the Holy Grail's departure from Lloegres, or England. So it stayed on in Wales, but it departed from Lloegres, which became the wasteland. In other words, what had been a spiritual presence left, and as a result the kingdom became a wasteland. The quest for the Grail in King Arthur's time was not a search for a physical object, but an attempt to establish a true core, i.e. the church. The round table was a reflection of this. So the round table, or the chapel of the round table, or whatever it was, that was the real Grail. And ironically, the Holy Spirit returned to Lloegres in 597. And this is when St. Augustine converted Ethelbert, King of Kent, to Christianity. Ironically, he was not Welsh. No, Ethelbert wasn't, but rather a direct descendant of the Jutish and pagan warrior Hengist. So Hengist and Horsa, his brother, are the bad guys in the Welsh annals. In Nennius and in Geoffrey of Monmouth, they're the ones who come from Jutland, which is Denmark, and settle in, first of all, Thanet. Then he persuades the king to give him Kent in return for marrying Hengist's daughter, King Vortigern. And then later on you get the beginning of the Saxon Wars and how England was lost to the pagan Saxons. But these same pagan Saxons convert to Christianity starting in the same place, starting in Canterbury, where Hengist came, So it's very ironic, I think. And Canterbury led the way in converting the hitherto pagan Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. Yes, from Canterbury, the first missionaries, the second church is built at Rochester in Kent, and then they build a church in York, and then that gets sacked by the pagan Saxons. And the poor old bishop there, he has to flee back to Kent. But eventually the whole of England gets converted. And King Alfred in Wessex, he's a very vigorous Christian, and he converts the Vikings, at least those in England, Gudrun, and has him baptized. So this is the return of the Grail, believe it or not. So Canterbury is a terribly, terribly important place to Britain, or especially to England. As I say, Christianity was still going on in Wales, They had the Celtic Church, they so-called, or Chaldee Church. But it had been lost in the Dark Ages in England and brought back by St. Augustine. And what's happened there now? Well, Canterbury Cathedral remains the preeminent cathedral or bishop's seat in the church founded by St. Augustine. Now, in St. Augustine's time, they were Catholics, or I don't know if they even used that term at the time, but he was sent by the Bishop of Rome, I think it was Clement VII, to convert the English, which he did, or at least those in Kent. But today, Canterbury Cathedral's been besmirched, yet the Spirit has left it as its venerable walls, which are surely Grade 1 listed. And this is a huge Norman church, very, very old, on a very, the primal site of English Christianity. You would think they treat it with respect, but in fact they stuck all this graffiti. Now, fortunately, these are sort of decals that they say they can take off again. It's only temporary exhibition. But what kind of treatment is this for your church? Should be the most sacred space in all of the Anglican Church. It used to be Roman Catholic Church, of course. And after the Reformation, it was taken over by the Church of England, at the time of Henry VIII. And it's been a preeminent church ever since, of the Church of England. But they treat it with this disrespect, this sort of wokeism of sticking graffiti up on it. At this same time, Christian Britain feels more under religious and cultural threat than any time since 597. Yeah, you feel our religious traditions are being, I won't say the word, but abused by the modern times, that many churches are being turned into mosques, or I've even seen churches that are turned into off-licenses or pubs. Well, I guess not so many people support the church, so something has to be done, and at least they're keeping the buildings up. But this is Canterbury Cathedral. It should be treated with more respect than this. And I'm shocked and appalled. So maybe it's time we prayed for forgiveness and once more sought the Holy Grail. So thank you if you managed to keep going this long. I've become longer than I was expecting. But there you have it. The Holy Grail is not an object. It is really a college. It's really a core. It's really the Christian fellowship. And as Jesus said, where 2 or 3 gather together in my name, there am I. And there he is symbolized by the Grail and the energies that come from that. So thank you for your time. And until next time, I bid you adieu. Bye for now.